Left with a fever and no name, the preacher took in the healer who saved others. First, the stranger in the wagon. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a settlement that had earned its name more from hope than from any actual redemption. Reverend Samuel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the general store, his weekly supplies weighing heavy in his arms. At 43, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much suffering and still believed in grace. The supply wagon from Fort Worth sat idle near the saloon, its driver nowhere to be seen. Samuel was about to continue on his way when he heard it, a soft, labored breathing coming from the back of the wagon. Curious, he approached and peered over the wooden slats. There, curled among sacks of grain and barrels of molasses, lay a woman. Her clothes were torn and stained with sweat and dirt, her dark hair matted against her fevered face. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her pallor made her look ghostly in the harsh afternoon light. "Jesus," Samuel whispered, setting down his supplies. He climbed into the wagon, his calloused hands hovering over her burning forehead. Her skin was on fire and her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Tom," Samuel called to the store owner who had followed him out. "Get Doc Peterson. Now." "Doc's been gone 3 days tending to the miller's boy," Tom replied, his voice strained. "Ain't nobody else knows healing round here." Samuel looked down at the woman's face, peaceful despite her obvious distress. Something in her features, maybe the way her lips moved silently as if in prayer, reminded him of his late wife Mary. He'd lost her to fever 5 years ago and he'd sworn never to feel that helpless again. "Then we'll tend to her ourselves," Samuel said, his voice firm with resolve. "Help me get her to the parsonage." Tom hesitated. "Samuel, you don't know nothing about her. Could be trouble, could be disease, could be someone's daughter," Samuel replied, already lifting the woman's shoulders. "Could be someone who needs help." The walk to the small parsonage behind the church felt endless. The woman's weight was slight, but her condition was grave. Samuel had seen fever like this before. It either broke in 3 days, or it took you. As they laid her on the narrow bed in his spare room, he caught sight of old scars on her wrists and arms, faded but unmistakable. This woman had seen violence. For the next 2 days, Samuel barely left her side. He bathed her fevered brow with cool water from the well, spooned thin broth between her cracked lips, and prayed harder than he had since Mary's death. The town's women took turns checking on them, bringing supplies and whispering among themselves about the mysterious stranger. On the third evening, as Samuel dozed in the chair beside her bed, he heard her voice for the first time. "The children," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "Don't let them drink the water from the east well. It's tainted." Samuel leaned forward, startled. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" But she had fallen back into unconsciousness, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined her words. Still, something about her tone, so urgent, so certain, made him decide to mention it to Tom the next morning. As dawn broke over Redemption Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the woman's fever finally broke. Samuel woke to find her eyes open, studying him with a mixture of wariness and gratitude. "You're awake," he said softly, setting aside his worn Bible. "How do you feel?" She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillow. "Like I've been trampled by a bull," she managed, her voice hoarse but clear. "Where am I?" "Redemption Creek, Texas. I'm Reverend Samuel Hayes. You were burning up with fever in the back of a supply wagon. Do you remember anything?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. "I remember traveling, being sick. Nothing before that." She looked at him directly. "Nothing at all." Samuel studied her face, noting the way her jaw tightened when she spoke of her past. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of people carrying burdens too heavy to share. "Well then," he said gently, "I suppose we'll start from here. What would you like to be called?" She considered this, her fingers absently tracing the scars on her wrist. "I don't know. What do you suggest? How about Grace? Seems fitting given the circumstances." For the first time she smiled, a small, tentative thing that transformed her entire face. "Grace," she repeated. "I like that." As the sun climbed higher, Samuel left her to rest and went to check on Tom's family. He found them gathered around the east well. Tom's youngest son bent over with stomach pains. The boy's mother looked up at Samuel with tear-filled eyes. "Started this morning," she said, "right after he drank from the well." Samuel remembered the woman's fevered words and felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever Grace's past held, it seemed her instincts for healing ran deeper than memory. Hands that remember. 3 weeks had passed since Grace had awakened in the parsonage, and she'd grown stronger each day. Her appetite had returned, color had bloomed in her cheeks, and she'd begun helping Samuel with small tasks around the church. But it was her response to the town's medical emergencies that truly set her apart. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Grace prepared breakfast for herself and Samuel. She'd insisted on earning her keep, and her cooking had proven surprisingly skilled. The smell of fresh biscuits and bacon filled the small room, a comfort Samuel hadn't experienced since Mary's death. "Morning, Grace," Samuel said, entering the kitchen with his shirt sleeves rolled up from morning chores. "Sleep better?" "Much, thank you." She poured him coffee from the pot, noting how he favored his left shoulder. "That shoulder's bothering you again?" Samuel paused, surprised. "How did you—" "The way you hold yourself, the slight wince when you lift your arm." Grace set down the coffee pot and moved toward him. "May I?" Before Samuel could respond, her hands were on his shoulder, fingers probing gently along the muscle. Her touch was sure, professional, finding the knots of tension with uncanny precision. As she worked, Samuel felt the pain ease in ways that weeks of self-treatment hadn't accomplished. "There," she said, stepping back. "Old injury, probably a fall. The muscle memory is still there, pulling everything out of alignment." Samuel rolled his shoulder experimentally, amazed at the relief. "How did you know how to do that?" Grace looked at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. I don't know. It just felt right." Their conversation was interrupted by frantic knocking at the door. Samuel opened it to find Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, tears streaming down her face. "Reverend Hayes, please, you have to come. It's my Jenny. She's been burned something terrible. The kettle spilled and Doc Peterson's still not back from the Miller place." Samuel grabbed his coat, but Grace was already moving, gathering clean cloth from the linen chest and checking Samuel's medical supplies. Supplies he'd forgotten he even had. "Bring the honey," she said without looking up, "and any whiskey you have. Clean whiskey." "Grace, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm, her movements efficient. "A child is hurt." They hurried to the blacksmith's shop, where 7-year-old Jenny Henderson lay on a cot, her left arm and shoulder wrapped in what looked like a torn shirt. The child's sobs filled the air, and her father, Big Jim Henderson, stood helplessly beside her. "Let me see," Grace said gently, kneeling beside the cot. Her voice had changed, softer, more soothing. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm Grace. Can you tell me what happened?" Through her tears, Jenny explained how she'd been helping her mother with the washing when the kettle of boiling water had tipped over. Grace carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage, revealing angry red burns along the child's arm. "It's going to be all right," Grace murmured, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She cleaned the wound with a mixture of honey and whiskey, her touch so gentle that Jenny's sobs gradually quieted to whimpers. "How do you know what to do?" Mrs. Henderson asked, watching in amazement as Grace applied a poultice made from ingredients she'd somehow known to bring. "I don't know," Grace admitted, never taking her eyes off Jenny. "But my hands do." As she worked, Samuel watched her transformation. This was not the confused, frightened woman he'd found in the wagon. This was someone with deep knowledge, someone who'd done this before, many times. "The burn isn't as bad as it looks," Grace explained to the parents. "Second degree, but it didn't go deep. Keep it clean and dry, change the dressing twice daily, and she should heal without scarring." "What about the pain?" Big Jim asked, his voice thick with emotion. Grace mixed another concoction from Samuel's supplies, willow bark tea with honey. "This will help, and keep her distracted. Tell her stories, play simple games. The mind is a powerful healer." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson grasped Grace's hands. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done without you." Walking back to the parsonage, Samuel was quiet. Grace sensed his thoughts. "You're wondering about me," she said. "I'm wondering about your past. That level of skill, Grace, you've been trained extensively by someone who knew medicine well." Grace stopped walking and looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mesquite trees. "I've been having dreams," she said quietly. "Fragments. I see myself in a place with white walls and rows of beds. I see people in pain, and I'm helping them, but I can't see faces clearly. I can't remember where or when. A hospital maybe? Maybe, or something like it." She turned to face him. "Samuel, what if my past isn't something I should remember? What if there's a reason I can't?" Samuel studied her face, seeing fear beneath the determination. "Grace, whatever happened to you before, it doesn't change who you are now. You saved that little girl today. You've been helping people since the day you woke up. That's what matters." That night, as Grace lay in her narrow bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to push away the flashes of memory that came unbidden. A man's voice, shouting, the smell of smoke, the weight of someone dying in her arms, and always, the overwhelming sense that she'd failed someone when they needed her most. Outside her window, the wind whistled through the desert, carrying with it the promise of change. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching horses, visitors in the night, which was unusual for Redemption Creek. She rose and peered through the curtain, seeing 3 riders dismounting near the saloon. Something about their silhouettes made her heart race with an inexplicable fear. She pulled back from the window, her hands trembling. Whatever past she was running from, Grace had the growing suspicion that it was finally catching up with her. The weight of secrets. The riders who had arrived in the night were still in town by morning, and their presence cast a shadow over Redemption Creek. Grace watched from the parsonage window as they moved through the streets, asking questions, showing something to the townspeople, a photograph perhaps, or a drawing. Samuel found her there when he returned from his morning visits to the sick. Her face was pale, her hands clenched at her sides. "Grace, what is it? Those men, they're looking for someone." She turned from the window, her eyes filled with a fear that made Samuel's chest tighten. "I think they might be looking for me." Before Samuel could respond, a knock came at the door. Grace stepped back instinctively, but Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." Samuel opened the door to find one of the riders, a tall man with steel gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes were hard, the kind that had seen too much violence. "Reverend Hayes, Marshal William Garrett, I'm hoping you can help me with something." "Of course, Marshal, what can I do for you?" The marshal pulled out a creased photograph and held it up. "I'm looking for this woman. She's wanted in connection with the incident up in Fort Worth. Goes by the name of Dr. Elizabeth Morgan." Samuel looked at the photograph, his heart sinking. Even with the formal pose and different clothing, there was no mistaking Grace's face. But something in the marshal's manner, the way he said incident, the hardness in his eyes, made Samuel hesitate. "May I ask what kind of incident?" "The kind that got a lot of good people killed," the marshal replied grimly. "She was treating patients in a makeshift hospital during a cholera outbreak. Claimed she was helping, but her treatments went wrong. 17 people died under her care, including 3 children. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. "Are you certain she was responsible?" "Certain enough. She disappeared the night after the last death, left behind a note saying she couldn't face what she'd done." The marshal studied Samuel's face. "You seen her, Reverend?" Samuel's mind raced. The woman he'd come to know, the gentle healer who'd saved little Jenny Henderson, who'd somehow known about the tainted well. Could she really be responsible for such tragedy? I need to think about this, Marshal. Can I have some time?" The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Time for what? Either you've seen her, or you haven't. I'm a man of God, Marshal. I don't make accusations lightly, especially against someone who might be innocent." "Fair enough, but Reverend, if you're harboring a fugitive, that makes you an accessory. I'll be in town for 2 more days. I suggest you search your conscience." The marshal tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Reverend, Dr. Morgan is considered dangerous. If you do encounter her, don't try to handle it alone." After the marshal left, Samuel stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the photograph in his hands. When he turned back into the house, Grace was standing in the kitchen doorway, her face white as cotton. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. Every word. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Elizabeth Morgan. The name, it feels familiar, like something I used to wear that doesn't fit anymore." Samuel closed the door and moved toward her. "Grace, I need you to tell me everything you can remember. Everything." She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "I remember the smell of carbolic acid, the sound of people coughing, struggling to breathe. I remember being so tired I could barely stand, but knowing I had to keep working because people were dying." Her voice broke. "I remember the children, 3 of them. They were so small, so trusting. What happened to them? I don't know." The words came out as a sob. "I remember giving them medicine, trying to bring their fevers down. I remember checking on them throughout the night. But then, nothing. Just waking up to find them." She couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Grace, Elizabeth, whatever your name is, I need you to listen to me. The woman I've come to know these past weeks would never deliberately hurt anyone. If those people died under your care, there has to be more to the story. But what if there isn't?" Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "What if I really am responsible? What if I've been running from the truth all this time? Then we'll face it together," Samuel said firmly. "But first I think we need to find out exactly what happened in Fort Worth." That afternoon, while the marshal and his men questioned other townspeople, Samuel and Grace retreated to the church. In the quiet sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar comfort of wooden pews and stained glass, Grace began to remember. "There was a man," she said slowly. "Dr. Hartwell. He was in charge of the hospital. He'd been treating the cholera patients with traditional methods, but people were still dying. That's when he brought me in." "Why you?" "Because I'd been experimenting with new treatments, combinations of herbs and minerals that showed promise. I'd saved lives before, Samuel. I know I had. But something went wrong." Grace nodded, her eyes distant. "The children seemed to be responding at first. Their fevers dropped, their breathing improved. But then, in the middle of the night, they all took a turn for the worse. By morning, they were gone." "And the other patients?" 14 more died over the next 2 days. All of them had received my treatment." She looked at Samuel with haunted eyes. "I killed them, Samuel. I was so arrogant, so sure I could save them, that I ended up destroying them. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Grace, you said you'd saved lives before with these treatments. Had you ever used them on cholera patients? No, never. Cholera was different, but I was desperate. People were dying, and the traditional treatments weren't working. I thought, she shook her head, I thought I was their only hope. What did Dr. Hartwell say? He was furious, said I'd overstepped my bounds, that I'd played God with people's lives. He was going to report me to the authorities, have me arrested for practicing medicine without proper certification. Grace's voice grew quieter. He was right to be angry. I wasn't even a real doctor. I was just a woman who'd learned healing from her grandmother and thought she knew better than trained physicians. As the sun began to set, painting the church in warm golden light, Samuel felt a growing certainty that there was more to this story than Grace remembered. The woman sitting beside him wasn't a careless killer. She was someone who'd been broken by tragedy and had convinced herself she was responsible for something beyond her control. Grace, he said gently, I think it's time we found out the whole truth, and I think I know how we can do it. Outside the church, the marshal's men continued their search, unaware that their quarry sat just yards away, finally ready to face her past. But as the evening shadows lengthened, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, when it came, might be more devastating than anything she could imagine. The truth in blood and water. The next morning, Samuel rode out before dawn, leaving Grace hidden in the church basement with strict instructions not to leave until his return. He'd told her he was going to Fort Worth to investigate, but he hadn't told her about the telegram he'd sent the night before to Dr. Marcus Webb, an old friend from his seminary days who'd become a physician. The journey to Fort Worth took him 6 hours through the harsh Texas landscape. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dust devils danced across the horizon like angry spirits. Samuel's horse, a sturdy bay named Moses, seemed to sense the urgency of their mission and maintained a steady pace despite the heat. Fort Worth was a bustling frontier town, much larger than Redemption Creek. Samuel made his way through the crowded streets to the hospital where the outbreak had occurred. The building was a simple wooden structure, but it was larger than he'd expected, with multiple wings and a constant stream of people coming and going. Dr. Webb was waiting for him in the hospital's main office, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. They'd been friends since their youth when both had felt called to serve others. Samuel through the church, Marcus through medicine. Samuel, Dr. Webb stood and embraced his old friend. I got your telegram. This is a serious matter you're involving yourself in. I know, Marcus, but I need to understand what really happened here. The woman I'm protecting, I don't believe she's capable of the crimes they're accusing her of. Dr. Webb gestured for Samuel to sit. I arrived 2 days after the incident to help with the investigation. What I found troubled me greatly. He pulled out a thick folder. This is the official report. According to Dr. Hartwell and the authorities, Elizabeth Morgan administered experimental treatments that directly caused the deaths of 17 patients. But you don't believe that? I believe she administered treatments that were different from the standard protocols. But Samuel, I've reviewed the medical records and I've tested samples of the medicine she used. There's something they're not telling you. Dr. Webb opened the folder and spread out several documents. Look at this, the patients who died. They all received Elizabeth's treatments, yes, but they also all received water from the hospital's main well during their treatment. Samuel leaned forward. The well? I had it tested, Samuel. The water was contaminated, not with cholera, but with mercury. Someone had been dumping mercury compounds into the well for weeks, possibly months. The levels were high enough to cause severe poisoning, especially in patients who were already weakened by disease. Samuel felt his heart pounding. So the treatments weren't what killed them? The treatments may have actually helped some of them fight off the cholera, but the mercury poisoning was too much for their weakened systems to handle. Dr. Webb's expression was grim. Samuel, Elizabeth Morgan didn't kill those patients. Someone else did. Who would do such a thing? That's what I've been trying to find out. The well was easily accessible and mercury compounds were readily available from the local mining operations. But it would have taken someone with knowledge of chemistry to know how to use them effectively. Samuel studied the documents, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. Dr. Hartwell, what do you know about him? More than I'd like to. Dr. Webb's voice was heavy. He'd been embezzling from the hospital for months. Money meant for medical supplies, food for patients, improvements to the facilities. When the cholera outbreak started, he was desperate to cover his tracks. So he let people die rather than admit his crimes. Worse than that, I think he may have actually caused the deaths to hide the evidence of his embezzlement. A mercury poisoning during a cholera outbreak would look like a treatment gone wrong, especially if he could find someone to blame. Samuel sat back in his chair, the full horror of the situation washing over him. Elizabeth was the perfect scapegoat, an unlicensed healer using experimental treatments. Exactly, And when she fled in guilt and horror, thinking she'd killed those people, it made his story even more believable. Where is Hartwell now? Gone. Disappeared the day after Elizabeth fled. But Samuel, there's something else. Dr. Webb pulled out another document. I found this in Hartwell's abandoned office. It's a letter he never sent, addressed to the territorial governor. In it, he admits to the mercury poisoning and implicates Elizabeth as an unwitting accomplice. Samuel read the letter, his hands shaking with anger. He was going to frame her completely, make it look like she was working with him. The marshal doesn't know about this letter or about my investigation. The official story is still that Elizabeth Morgan killed those patients through negligence and experimental treatments. Then we need to get this information to the authorities. Dr. Webb shook his head. It's not that simple. The marshal, William Garrett, he's been tracking Elizabeth for months. He's convinced she's a dangerous criminal, and he's not the type to admit he's been wrong. Then what do? We prove Elizabeth's innocence publicly, force the truth into the open where it can't be ignored. Dr. Webb stood and moved to the window, looking out at the bustling street. But Samuel, this is dangerous. If Hartwell is still alive, he won't hesitate to kill to protect his secret. And if he's not, whoever helped him might be just as desperate. Samuel joined his friend at the window. Marcus, I need to ask you something. Will you come back to Redemption Creek with me? Will you help me prove Elizabeth's innocence? Dr. Webb was quiet for a long moment. You're asking me to risk my career, my reputation, maybe even my life. I'm asking you to help save an innocent woman who's been carrying the weight of 17 deaths that weren't her fault. And if we're wrong, if she really is responsible? Samuel thought of Grace, of her gentle hands healing little Jenny's burns, of her instinct to help others even when she was barely recovered herself, of the haunted look in her eyes when she spoke of the children who'd died. Then we'll face that truth together. But Marcus, I know this woman. She's not a killer. She's a healer who's been broken by guilt that isn't hers to carry. Dr. Webb turned from the window and looked at his old friend. When do we leave? As the sun began to set over Fort Worth, Samuel and Dr. Webb prepared for the journey back to Redemption Creek. Neither man knew that they were already being watched or that their investigation had set in motion events that would bring Elizabeth Morgan's past crashing down around her with devastating force. In Redemption Creek, Grace waited in the church basement, praying for Samuel's safe return and unaware that the truth she'd been running from was finally coming to light. But outside, Marshal Garrett was growing impatient, and his suspicions about the helpful preacher were beginning to harden into certainty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Grace's faith in herself, but Samuel's faith in the power of truth to overcome injustice. When truth meets steel, Samuel and Dr. Webb rode into Redemption Creek just as the sun was setting, their horses weary from the long journey. The town seemed unusually quiet, and Samuel noticed the marshal's men stationed at various points along the main street. His heart sank as he realized they were watching for his return. Samuel, Dr. Webb said quietly, we're walking into a trap. I know, but we don't have a choice. Samuel dismounted near the church, his eyes scanning for any sign of Grace. We need to get to the church. I hid Elizabeth in the basement. They made it only halfway across the churchyard before Marshal Garrett stepped out of the shadows, his gun drawn but lowered. Behind him, two of his deputies emerged from their hiding spots. Reverend Hayes, the marshal said, his voice cold. You're under arrest for harboring a fugitive. Marshal, I need to speak with you. I have information about Elizabeth Morgan that changes everything. The time for talk is over. Where is she? Samuel looked at the marshal, seeing the determination in his eyes. This was a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed by evidence or reason. She's not here. Don't lie to me, preacher. My men have been watching this town all day. Nobody's left and she hasn't been seen. That means she's hidden somewhere, and you're the only one who would help her. Dr. Webb stepped forward. Marshal, I'm Dr. Marcus Webb from Fort Worth. I have evidence that Elizabeth Morgan is innocent of the charges against her. The marshal's attention shifted to Dr. Webb. What kind of evidence? Medical records, water samples, proof that the deaths in Fort Worth were caused by mercury poisoning, not by her treatments. Convenient story, Doc. You have any proof of this? Dr. Webb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the folder of documents. Everything is here. Test results, witness statements, even a confession letter from Dr. Hartwell admitting to the mercury poisoning. Marshal Garrett took the folder but didn't open it. Even if this is true, it doesn't change the fact that she fled the scene of a crime. That makes her a fugitive. She fled because she thought she was responsible for those deaths, Samuel said. She was overcome with guilt and horror at what she believed she'd done. And that's supposed to make me feel sorry for her? The marshal's voice was harsh. 17 people died, including 3 children. Someone has to pay for that. Samuel felt his temper rising. The person responsible is Dr. Hartwell, who embezzled money and poisoned the water supply to cover his tracks. Elizabeth Morgan is a victim, not a criminal. That's enough. The marshal motioned to his deputies. Search the church. Search the parsonage. Turn this place upside down if you have to. As the deputies moved toward the church, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. "Wait!" Everyone turned to look at him. "I'll make you a deal, Marshal. Let Dr. Webb present his evidence to the town. Let the people of Redemption Creek hear the truth about what happened in Fort Worth. If, after hearing everything, they still believe Elizabeth Morgan is guilty, I'll tell you where she is." The marshal considered this. "And if they believe she's innocent, then you let her go, and you go after the real criminals." "That's not how the law works, preacher. But it's how justice works," Samuel replied. "You're a lawman, Marshal. Don't you want to make sure you're arresting the right person?" The marshal was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face. "You really believe she's innocent, don't you?" "I'd stake my life on it. You might be doing exactly that." The marshal holstered his gun. "All right, preacher. You've got 1 hour to present your evidence. But if I'm not convinced, I'm taking you both into custody as accessories." Word spread quickly through Redemption Creek that there would be a gathering at the church. By nightfall, most of the town had assembled in the small sanctuary. Samuel stood at the pulpit with Dr. Webb beside him and Marshal Garrett and his deputies in the front row. "Friends," Samuel began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "we're here tonight to talk about truth and justice and the danger of rushing to judgment." He told them about Elizabeth Morgan, how she'd been found half dead in a supply wagon, how she'd recovered and begun helping the sick, how she'd somehow known about the contaminated well that had made the Henderson boys sick. "The woman you know as Grace," Samuel continued, "is Dr. Elizabeth Morgan. She's been hiding among us not because she's a criminal, but because she believes she's responsible for the deaths of 17 people in Fort Worth." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Samuel saw shock and fear on some faces, but also sympathy and understanding on others. Dr. Webb stepped forward and presented his evidence methodically and clearly. He showed the medical records, explained the water test results, and read portions of Dr. Hartwell's confession letter. As he spoke, Samuel watched the marshal's face, seeing doubt begin to creep into his expression. "The truth is," Dr. Webb concluded, "Elizabeth Morgan didn't kill those patients. She tried to save them. The real killer was Dr. Hartwell, who poisoned the hospital's water supply to cover up his embezzlement." When Dr. Webb finished, Marshal Garrett stood up. "That's all very interesting, Doc. But where's your proof that this confession letter is real? How do I know you didn't write it yourself?" "Because I have this," a voice said from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Grace standing in the doorway, her chin raised with quiet dignity. She looked different, stronger, more confident. In her hands, she held a small leather journal. "Elizabeth," Samuel breathed, torn between relief and terror. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent church. "This is Dr. Hartwell's personal journal. I took it from his office the night I fled Fort Worth. I've been too afraid to read it, but after hearing Dr. Webb's testimony, I found the courage." She handed the journal to Dr. Webb, who opened it and read aloud. "The mercury compound is working faster than I expected. The patients are dying quickly, and the symptoms look enough like treatment complications to be believable. Morgan suspects nothing. When this is over, I'll have enough evidence to blame her for everything, and my financial irregularities will be forgotten in the scandal." The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Marshal Garrett took the journal and read several more entries, his face growing darker with each page. "There's more," Grace said quietly. "Dr. Hartwell didn't just embezzle money. He was selling medical supplies to Confederate sympathizers and replacing them with inferior substitutes. Patients were dying from tainted medicines long before the cholera outbreak." She looked directly at the marshal. "I was trying to save people who were already being killed by the man who was supposed to be their doctor. When I realized what was happening, I tried to expose him. That's when he accelerated his plan to frame me." Marshal Garrett closed the journal and looked at Grace for a long moment. "Why didn't you come forward with this before?" "Because I thought I was responsible for their deaths. I thought my experimental treatments had failed, and I couldn't bear the weight of that guilt. It wasn't until I came here, until I started healing again, that I realized the truth." The marshal turned to address the congregation. "Based on this evidence, I'm satisfied that Elizabeth Morgan is innocent of the charges against her. The real criminal is Dr. Hartwell, and I'll be issuing a warrant for his arrest." Relief flooded through the church, but Grace wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said. "Dr. Hartwell isn't dead. He's been hiding in San Antonio using the name Dr. Henry Walsh. He's been practicing medicine there, and if he's true to form, he's probably still killing patients." The marshal's expression hardened. "How do you know this?" "Because 3 weeks ago when truth meets steel," continued. "Because 3 weeks ago I received a letter from a nurse in San Antonio," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. She'd heard about the Fort Worth incident and recognized the symptoms she was seeing in her hospital. Patients dying unexpectedly, always after receiving treatment from Dr. Walsh. She suspected something was wrong but didn't know who to trust. Grace reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I've been carrying this letter," afraid to act on it because I thought I was a murderer myself. But now I know the truth and I can't let him kill more innocent people." Marshal Garrett took the letter and read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. "This nurse, Sarah Mitchell, she says 5 patients have died in the past month alone, all under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Hartwell, or Dr. Walsh as he's calling himself now, is still out there, still killing people to cover his tracks and line his pockets," Grace said. "Every day we delay gives him more opportunities to destroy lives." Samuel stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Grace's shoulder. "Marshal, you have your real criminal. What happens now?" The marshal folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Now I wire the authorities in San Antonio and organize a proper manhunt. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, you're free to go. In fact, I'd like you to come with me to San Antonio. Your testimony could be crucial in stopping this man." Grace looked at Samuel, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. I don't know if I'm ready to face him again." "You don't have to face him alone," Samuel said firmly. "I'll come with you." Dr. Webb nodded. "As will I. We've started this together, and we'll finish it together." The marshal studied the 3 of them, the preacher, the doctor, and the healer who had found her courage again. "All right then, we leave for San Antonio at first light." As the congregation began to disperse, many of the townspeople approached Grace with words of support and gratitude. Mrs. Henderson grasped her hands tightly. "I knew you were a good woman from the moment you saved my Jenny," she said. "Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth." Big Jim Henderson nodded gravely. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you just ask. This town owes you a debt." One by one, the people of Redemption Creek offered their support, and Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The warmth of community acceptance and the strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. Later that evening, as Grace and Samuel walked back to the parsonage, the weight of the day's revelations settled around them. "I'm scared, Samuel," Grace admitted. "What if we can't stop him? What if he escapes again? Then we'll keep hunting him until we do," Samuel replied. "Grace, you've carried the guilt of 17 deaths that weren't your fault. You've hidden from a truth that wasn't yours to bear. But now you have the chance to save lives, to stop a real killer from claiming more victims." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why did you help me? Why did you risk everything for a stranger?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars scattered across the vast Texas sky. "Because sometimes God puts people in our path who need healing, and sometimes he puts us in their path because we need to be the healers. I lost my wife to fever 5 years ago, and I swore I'd never feel that helpless again. Helping you helped me remember that we're not helpless, we're just called to help each other. And if something happens to you because of me, then I'll face it knowing I did the right thing. Grace, you're not just running toward justice now, you're running toward who you were meant to be. A healer, a protector, someone who saves lives instead of taking them." The next morning came too quickly. Marshal Garrett and his deputies were ready to ride at dawn, and Dr. Webb had already prepared medical supplies and documentation they might need. Grace stood in the doorway of the parsonage, looking back at the small home that had given her sanctuary and a new identity. "It's not goodbye," Samuel said, reading her thoughts. "This is your home now, and it will be here when you return." Grace smiled, the first truly peaceful smile she'd worn since arriving in Redemption Creek. "When I return, not if, when," Samuel confirmed. "Now let's go catch a killer." As the small party rode out of Redemption Creek, the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and promise. Grace no longer felt like a woman running from her past. She felt like a woman riding toward her future, armed with the truth and surrounded by people who believed in her. Behind them, the town of Redemption Creek lived up to its name, having given one lost soul the chance to find herself again. And ahead of them, in San Antonio, Dr. Henry Walsh was about to discover that some sins cannot be hidden forever, and some healers refuse to let killers wear their faces. The chase was on, and this time, Elizabeth Morgan, Grace, was not running away. She was running toward justice. The reckoning in San Antonio. The ride to San Antonio took 3 days through the harsh Texas landscape, but Grace felt stronger with each mile. The nightmares that had plagued her for months were fading, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Fort Worth in the dark of night. She was a healer on a mission to stop a killer. On the evening of the second day, as they made camp beside a small stream, Dr. Webb approached Grace with a serious expression. "Elizabeth, I need to prepare you for what we might find in San Antonio. If Hartwell has been practicing medicine there under a false name, he's had time to establish himself, gain the trust of the community. People might not want to believe what we're telling them." Grace poked at the campfire with a stick, watching the sparks dance upward into the star-filled sky. "I've been thinking about that. What if we can't convince the authorities? What if his word carries more weight than ours? Then we'll have to catch him in the act," Marshal Garrett said grimly. but that means putting innocent lives at risk. No, Grace's voice was firm. No more innocent lives. I have a plan, but it's dangerous. Samuel moved closer to the fire, his face etched with concern. What kind of plan? I'll pose as a patient, someone desperately ill who needs immediate treatment. If Hartwell is still using his old methods, poisoning patients to cover his embezzlement, he'll try to kill me too. Absolutely not, Samuel said immediately. Grace, you're not bait. I'm the only one who knows his methods intimately. I'm the only one who can recognize the signs of his poisoning techniques and survive them long enough to expose him. Dr. Webb shook his head. It's too risky. What if something goes wrong? What if he recognizes you? He won't. I've changed since Fort Worth. I'm stronger, healthier, and I'll be disguised as a different type of patient. Maybe someone with a chronic condition rather than acute illness. Marshall Garrett studied her face in the firelight. You're serious about this? Dead serious. We need evidence that will hold up in court. We need to catch him in the act of attempted murder. It's the only way to ensure he never hurts anyone again. The discussion continued long into the night with Samuel and Dr. Webb raising objections and Grace systematically addressing each concern. Finally, as the fire died down to glowing embers, they reached a reluctant agreement. But we do this my way, Marshall Garrett said. I'll have men stationed throughout the hospital. At the first sign of real danger, we move in. And I'll be posing as a consulting physician, Dr. Webb added. I can monitor the situation from the inside. Samuel remained quiet, his worry evident in every line of his face. Finally, he spoke. I'm going to be praying harder than I've ever prayed in my life. Good, Grace said softly. I'm going to need all the divine protection I can get. They reached San Antonio the next afternoon, and the city's bustling energy was a stark contrast to the quiet of Redemption Creek. The hospital where Dr. Henry Walsh was practicing was a large, well-funded institution in the heart of the city. Grace felt her heart rate increase as they approached the building where she would soon confront the man who had destroyed so many lives. Dr. Webb went in first, establishing his credentials and arranging to observe some of the medical procedures. He returned an hour later with disturbing news. He's here, and he's exactly as you described. Charming, confident, and completely trusted by the hospital staff. But Elizabeth, I observed him with 3 patients and I saw the signs. Small doses of mercury compounds being administered under the guise of legitimate treatment. How long before those patients show symptoms? Grace asked. Based on what I observed, probably within the next day or 2. We need to move fast. That evening, Grace transformed herself into Maria Santos, a young woman suffering from mysterious stomach ailments that had baffled doctors in her hometown. She bound her chest to appear thinner, darkened her hair with coffee grounds, and affected a slight accent that would disguise her voice. The next morning, she walked into the hospital as a desperate patient seeking help. Dr. Henry Walsh was exactly as she remembered, tall, silver-haired, with kind eyes that masked a calculating mind. He examined her with professional thoroughness, asking detailed questions about her symptoms and medical history. I believe I can help you, Miss Santos, he said finally. Your symptoms suggest a severe digestive disorder, but with the right treatment, you should recover fully. Grace felt her blood run cold as she recognized the same confident tone he'd used in Fort Worth when discussing her experimental treatments with the cholera patients. What kind of treatment, doctor? A series of mineral supplements that will restore your body's natural balance. The treatment is somewhat unconventional, but I've had remarkable success with it. Mineral supplements. Grace kept her voice steady. What kind of minerals? Nothing you need to worry about, my dear. Just trust me to take care of you. As Dr. Walsh prepared her first dose of medicine, Grace noticed his hands, the same hands that had mixed mercury compounds in Fort Worth, the same hands that had condemned 17 innocent people to death. Doctor, she said quietly, have you ever treated cholera patients? His hand paused for just a moment as he measured the powder. Why do you ask? I heard there was an outbreak in Fort Worth last year. Terrible tragedy. They say a woman doctor killed many patients with experimental treatments. Dr. Walsh's expression darkened. Yes, I heard about that. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, I believe. A dangerous woman who thought she knew better than trained physicians. She's still at large, you know. Still a threat to innocent people. Grace felt rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. What do you think should happen to her? Justice, he said simply, handing her the glass of medicine. She should pay for what she did to those poor souls. Grace took the glass knowing it contained the same mercury compounds that had killed the patients in Fort Worth. You're right, doctor. Justice is exactly what she deserves. She pretended to drink the medicine, letting most of it spill down her chin and onto her dress while Dr. Walsh was making notes in her chart. When he looked up, she was wiping her mouth with a handkerchief. Excellent. You should begin to feel better within a few hours. I'll want to see you again tomorrow for your next dose. That night, Grace met with Samuel, Dr. Webb, and Marshall Garrett in their hotel room. She carefully poured the remaining medicine from the vial she'd managed to conceal into a glass for analysis. "It's mercury chloride," Dr. Webb confirmed after testing the sample, "in concentrations that would have killed you within days if you'd actually consumed it." "And I heard him talking to the hospital administrator," Marshall Garrett added. "3 patients died last week, all of them under his care. He's been billing the hospital for expensive treatments while giving them poison. Tomorrow he'll want to give me a second dose," Grace said. "That's when we'll have him." "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Samuel asked. "We have enough evidence to arrest him now." "No, we don't. We have circumstantial evidence and suspicions. I need to catch him in the act, get him to admit what he's doing. It's the only way to ensure justice for all his victims." The next day, Grace returned to the hospital, this time with Marshall Garrett and his deputies positioned throughout the building. Dr. Webb was in the next room, ready to intervene if needed. "Miss Santos," Dr. Walsh smiled as she entered his office. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, doctor. Your treatment is working wonderfully." "Excellent. Today's dose will be slightly stronger, to accelerate your recovery." Grace watched as he prepared the medicine, noting how he carefully measured each component. "Doctor, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my dear. In Fort Worth, when that woman doctor was killing patients with her treatments, do you think she knew what she was doing?" Dr. Walsh paused in his preparation. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you think she was deliberately murdering them, or was she just incompetent?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you asking about this?" Grace met his gaze directly. "Because I'm Elizabeth Morgan." The glass vial slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. For a moment, they stared at each other in complete silence. Then Dr. Walsh lunged for the drawer where Grace knew he kept a small pistol. "Marshall Garrett!" she shouted, jumping back from the desk. The door burst open, and Marshall Garrett entered with his gun drawn. "Dr. Henry Walsh, you're under arrest for the murders of 17 people in Fort Worth and at least 5 more here in San Antonio." Dr. Walsh slowly raised his hands, his face a mask of fury and defeat. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can," Dr. Webb said, entering the room behind the marshal. "We have your journal from Fort Worth, witness testimony, and chemical analysis of the poisons you've been using." "It's over, Hartwell." As the marshal placed handcuffs on Dr. Walsh, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being served in the name of all the innocent victims who had died because of this man's greed and callousness. "Dr. Elizabeth Morgan," Marshall Garrett said formally, "on behalf of the state of Texas, I apologize for the wrongful accusations against you. You're free to go, and you have our gratitude for helping us catch the real killer." Grace nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As they led Dr. Walsh away, she heard him mutter something under his breath about meddling women and interfering preachers. Even in defeat, he couldn't accept responsibility for his crimes. Epilogue. Grace found. 6 months later, Grace stood in the doorway of the new clinic she'd established in Redemption Creek, watching the sun set over the Texas desert. The building was small but well-equipped, funded by donations from grateful patients and a substantial reward from the state of Texas for her role in capturing Dr. Walsh. Samuel approached from the parsonage carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the peaceful expression of a man who had found his purpose. "How many patients today?" he asked, handing her a cup. 12, including Mrs. Henderson's new baby, a healthy boy who's already showing signs of his father's stubbornness. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the desert come alive with the sounds of evening. Grace had legally reclaimed her name, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, but the townspeople still called her Grace, and she'd grown to love the name Samuel had given her. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked, "coming back here instead of returning to a big city hospital?" Grace considered the question, thinking of the lives she'd saved, the families she'd helped, the community that had embraced her completely. "Never. This is where I belong. This is where I found myself again." "And what about us? Do you ever regret this?" Samuel's voice was uncertain, hopeful. Grace smiled and took his hand. They'd been married 2 months ago in a ceremony that had drawn people from 3 counties. It had been a long journey from the day he'd found her burning with fever in the back of a supply wagon, but every step had led them to this moment. "Samuel Hayes," she said, "you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. How could I regret that?" In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound was answered from across the desert. Grace thought of all the people who had helped her find her way back to herself. Samuel, Dr. Webb, Marshall Garrett, and even the people of Redemption Creek, who had accepted her without question. She had been a woman without a name, burning with fever and guilt. Now she was Dr. Elizabeth Grace Morgan Hayes, a healer who had found her place in the world and the love of a man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The town of Redemption Creek had lived up to its name, offering salvation to a woman who had thought she was beyond saving. And in return, she had given them something precious, proof that redemption was possible, that healing could come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith was simply refusing to give up on someone when they couldn't find the strength to believe in themselves. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace and Samuel walked back toward their home, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of gratitude for the twisted path that had brought them together. Behind them, the clinic stood ready to serve anyone who needed healing, a testament to the power of second chances and the grace that could be found in the most unlikely places. The story of the preacher and the healer had become legend in that part of Texas, told and retold around campfires and kitchen tables. But for Grace and Samuel, it was simply their beginning, the first chapter of a life built on faith, healing, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. In Redemption Creek, they had both found what they were looking for, a place to belong, a purpose to serve, and a love that could heal even the deepest wounds. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Grace would remember the woman she had been, fevered, nameless, and lost, and she would whisper a prayer of thanksgiving for the preacher who had taken her in and helped her find her way back to herself. The end.